Welcome back. In this lesson, we'll learn about the time-honored technique of trapunto, where the stitch count is low and the appeal is high. I'll show you how to select suitable fabrics, how to identify suitable designs, and how to experiment with color using pens and paints and paint sticks. Then I'll show you how to use cording to puff up your designs. So I'm first going to show you how to select your fabric. I really like to use casual knits for this technique because you can really get a lot more impact from very low stitch count designs, and you can use t-shirts, you can use sweatshirts, and a bonus with the sweatshirts is that they have a bit of built-in padding. If you want to use woven fabrics, I recommend that you stick with the silkier types because they're going to have a tendency to be raised more easily. A firm or stiffer fabric is not going to puff no matter how much padding that you insert. So I like to use a softer, more supple fabric for the wovens, like this silk charmeuse. The knits really work very well, especially when you select your padding correctly. The padding that I like to use is 1/4 inch foam. You can use 1/2 inch foam if you want a little more drama, and I recommend that you use your upholstery supply as a resource for your foam. I love to use the foam more than batting, which is an optional padding material, because the foam tears very cleanly against the stitching line. When the stitching is complete with the foam, you can simply tear it against the stitching, and it makes finishing time go like a breeze. So as you can see, it tears sharply against the stitching, unlike the batting, which has to be cut. And batting is tougher than you think when you start cutting it out away from the edge of the embroidery. The materials can be any kind of thread or stabilizer that you like to use that's suitable for your host fabric. And we're simply going to make a sandwich using a cutaway stabilizer. And the reason we use cutaway is because we want to hold the batting or the foam in place for the life of the item. So I'm using a cutaway traditional stabilizer combined with a 1/4 inch foam in this example. So I'm going to hoop this in my t-shirt, and as always, I'm going to have my stabilizer larger than my hoop so that it is enclosed completely in the hoop. And I'm going to insert my outer ring with the hardware extending from the neck area of the garment. And in this instance, rather than just the single layer of the stabilizer, I'm going to be inserting 2 layers, the stabilizer and the foam. When you cut the foam for your embroidery hoop, you want to make it smaller than the hoop, but almost as large as the hoop. And so for that reason, I like to kind of cut off the corners so that it fits easily inside my hoop area. But I don't want to cut it too small because I don't want to have to worry about whether it's hitting the design area. So I want it almost the size of my hoop, but I don't want to be trapping it inside the hoop because then I would be hooping too much bulk. So as you're inserting, you want to maneuver the foam to make sure that it stays inside the hoop area. And as always, we're going to use good hooping technique for a knit fabric, which for me means that I'm going to center my location with my marking. Then you're still going to smooth your fabric. And I like to trap the fabric and the stabilizer against the top edge of the hoop and smooth the fabric downward. and then just gently insert that bottom edge of the hoop. And as you can see, it looks puffed already, doesn't it? Now I'm going to put this into the machine and we'll stitch it. Now, just a word about suitable designs. We're going to be stitching a red work design. And a red work design is a design that is an imitation of an old hand technique that has minimal stitches, just an outline. And so that's what's going to puff. Now, some red work designs will work like this is just a basic red work design, stock design. It works very nicely. This is just a basic red work stock design that does not work well because it does not completely trap the foam at the very beginning of the design, which is very important. So we end up with these little pleats and puckers, which of course is not acceptable. So even though this has a perimeter border, it stitches in segments. So what we need to do is trap all of the foam at the very beginning, which the design that we're about to stitch does nicely. Also, if you're using a stock red work design, you may want to consider changing the stitch type to a bean stitch, which is a triple stitch, and that gives you a bolder, richer look, and it also provides better security for the design. So let's get this into the machine and start stitching. And because I have my garment loaded sideways so that the hardware is extending through the neck area, making it easy to access the embroidery area, I've rotated my design. So just be aware that you may need to rotate your design as well, depending on the orientation of your item in the hoop. I have my design selected, but before I press go on a trapunto design, I want to be sure to raise my bobbin thread first before I begin stitching. And the reason this is important is because this is just a running stitch or a bean stitch. So it's important to catch those very first few stitches so that you don't have some missing at the very beginning, because they often don't pick up those first 2 or 3 stitches, which won't matter on a regular design. But on a red work type design, it's important. So on this particular machine, I can just press the button that lowers the needle twice, and that will pull up the bobbin thread. So first I'll thread my needle. And now I'm going to press the button once and once again, and I've pulled up my bobbin thread. And I'm ready to stitch. So the design is complete and we're ready to begin the finishing process. So we'll unhoop, and I'm going to be coloring in this design, so I need to remove the foam first, because if I don't remove the foam before coloring, I don't want these raised areas to trap any of the color from my brush. And when I turn the shirt inside out to remove the stabilizer, there could be color transfer onto the shirt. So I'm going to remove the foam first. And as I mentioned, I love the foam because it tears away so cleanly. So we're just going to go around the edge of the design and just tear it away next to the stitching line. And it tears quite cleanly. And this foam is able to be laundered and dried in the dryer or dry cleaned. So it's compatible with really any laundering method that you want to use. And as you may have noted during the stitching, the larger areas of the design actually puff better than the smaller areas. And so when you're choosing a design, you want to choose large open areas. They are going to work the best for you. Now I'm going to remove the stabilizer, and of course the best practice is to always keep the back of the stabilizer and the back of the garment visible at all times. And I like to just glide my scissors whenever possible and avoid that cutting action, because that can, of course, nick a garment. And I like to cut about 1/8 of an inch away from the stitching line to provide a little platform for the stitches or the embroidery to stand up on. And I love these particular scissors for removing the stabilizer because they have little serrations on the blades. And these are called perfect scissors, and I really think they are, particularly for removing stabilizer. So now we're ready to begin applying color. So now our design is complete on the garment and we're ready to add color. And I'd like to show you some of the ways that I like to add color and some of the options that are available for fabric coloring. One of the techniques that I used in the past is the Fabrico pens by Sucaniko. They're really great, but they put a lot of color on. So if you want a little bit more subtle technique, you might want to use one of the fabric paints or the oil paint sticks. These are actually real oil paint, but when they're heat set, they're permanent. And actually, you do want to always check the manufacturer's recommendations for setting your ink, because many of them do require that they be heat set. And these oil sticks, paint sticks do require that, and we're going to do that. So I'm going to begin painting, and to begin I'm going to select a color, and these paint sticks are self-healing, so they have a little skin that you remove before you begin painting. And remember that craft foam that you may have purchased and found out it wasn't suitable for embroidery? Well, here's how you can use that foam. We're going to use it as our palette. And when we use it as a palette, it provides a couple of benefits. First, it pulls the paint off the stick better than a slick surface. Some people like to use freezer paper as a palette, but it doesn't have the ability to pull as much paint off the stick because it's slick. Also, if you get too much paint on your brush, you can pull paint off your brush from the craft foam. So I'm going to apply color to my stick, and I'm just rubbing it around on the paint that I've applied to my palette. And of course, you can put as many of these colors out on your palette as you may need to. I'm just going to show you how to apply the color to the garment. And I recommend that you go in the direction of the knit, kind of the grain of the fabric, so that you may have a tendency to want to go with the shape of the design, but the color will apply more evenly if you stick with going with the direction of the knit. So you're just going to kind of color, trying to stay in the lines. And by the way, these sponge brushes can be used with the liquid paint or the oil sticks, and they are reusable, but I like to get the sharp ones rather than the rounded tip because I can get into the smaller areas more easily. So just apply the colors you like. You can use more than one color. You can apply it as dark or as light as you want. But the main thing is, when you're finished, it needs to be heat set. And I have one that I've colored in more completely, and it's ready to be heat set. So you have a couple of options here. Remember, this is oil paint, so you don't want to transfer it to your iron. So when you get ready to iron, you could use pressing paper like this that you can buy at the fabric store, or you could use a craft Teflon sheet like this that you can also buy at the fabric or hobby store. And this really comes in handy for a lot of reasons. So I'm going to move my coloring materials out of the way and show you how to heat set the design. We're just simply going to lay it out and put our pressing sheet on top, and you do want to leave the iron in position in the same area without smearing it around, because you don't want to transfer that ink. You really just want to lift and press if your design is larger. So you want to press the various areas and follow the manufacturer's recommendations. After it's been heat set, it can be laundered using your normal laundry methods, but always be sure to check your manufacturer's instructions for your particular coloring method. Next, I'm going to show you how to puff up your designs with cording. Now we'll learn how to raise the fabric using cording in this trapunto technique. I love to use it on linens because it's very simple but has an elegant appearance. It works great on a firm woven fabric like this. You do need to be cautious about using it on a high thread count fabric like this because you can tend to get a bit of puckering. But it's important to know that you can use a very slender blade and a very sharp point needle, perhaps a microtex needle if you have one on hand, because it's going to penetrate these high thread count fabrics much more cleanly. So this is an elegant technique, and I'm going to be using a hooped base of cutaway stabilizer because we need a permanent stabilizer to hold that cording in for the life of the item. And I'm going to be using cording that you can pick up in the home deck department of your fabric store. And we're going to cut this to a length of about 6 inches and we're going to need 2 pieces because this continuous design actually is in 2 parts. We're going to lay our cording this way and then this way. So we're going to stitch an outline of the scroll right onto our cutaway stabilizer, and then we're going to apply the cording. I'm going to pre-spray the cording using an embroidery spray adhesive, and you want to be sure that you coat the cording pretty thoroughly. So I recommend that you turn it over during the spraying process. So I'm going to just spray this cording now, and I've lined my box with multiple sheets of paper. So after I spray this cording, I can just remove the paper and I have a clean base to work with. And I do suggest that you keep some baby wipes on your work table so that you can clean your hands off from the spray adhesive. So I'm just going to spray. And we use the spray box to contain the overspray because you don't want this embroidery spray adhesive, even though it's temporary, to get on things around your embroidery studio, like your machine. So we've sprayed the cording. Now I'm going to insert the hoop in the machine. And as with our previous trapunto technique, I'm going to pull my bobbin thread up. And I'm going to do that by pressing my needle down once and then again. And I have my bobbin thread up. And you may also need to test your tension before you do this technique. I find that I get best results on these running stitch designs when I tighten my tension up a bit, because it just gets a cleaner, better balanced tension. So now we're ready to begin stitching. Now we are going to remove the hoop from the machine to apply the cording. I'm trimming away these excess threads because I don't want them to show through my finished project. I'm going to take one of my pieces of cord. You can begin just a bit away from the end of the shape and just follow the shape of the scroll. Be sure you stay inside the lines and your project will come out very nice. Just be sure that your cording has enough embroidery spray adhesive to hold it firmly in position so that it doesn't shift during the embroidery process. So we've almost got this piece completely laid, and I'm going to trim it just a bit to end just short of that shape. And I'm going to cut off just a bit more because you don't want a bunch of bulk at the end of your object. So this side is complete, and I'm just going to repeat for the other side. And again, I like to cut off the end to give me a nice clean edge. And I'm going to start at this end and just follow the shape around. And if you digitize, this is really easy to create your own shapes by doing a running stitch or a bean stitch just parallel to each other. And again, I'm going to trim this now that I've reached the end of the scroll. And it looks like I need to trim just a bit more. And when you get the cording applied, take a moment to be sure that it's all, like you see right here, I'm not quite inside the line, so I'm going to use tweezers or a tool to make sure that I scooch it into position so that it is going to fall inside the outline that we're about to apply on top. Okay, so this is ready to go back into the machine. I can use my item without any marking because I can see through it. So I can apply the item and tell exactly where it's going to be applied. So I can feel with my fingers, I can see through the item and go ahead and just restart the machine. You could actually apply a little embroidery spray adhesive if you want, but the stickiness that's already on the cording can provide that hold for you. And as you see, as I've pressed this down, you can see a bit of the shadow of the cording through the item. And I can see that it's not quite centered, so I'm going to lift it and move it a bit over towards me. But before I do that, I need to recheck and make sure that everything is still on track because I lifted my piece. So everything looks good, and I'm going to reapply. And use your fingers as a guide, and also your hoop. I've got the center marking on my hoop so I can align my center point here, feel with my fingers here, and press into position. And you see the shadow of the scroll, and it's now centered. And I'm ready to begin. But remember, as before, I still want to lift my bobbin thread to the top before beginning stitching. So I'm going to lower the thread and raise the thread and then begin. And I'm going to stop it here and trim so that I don't trap this excess thread. So now it's complete, and if you wish, you can apply the initial of your choice below the scroll. Next, we're going to have some fun with fringe.